My birthday was supposed to be a quiet evening. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just a simple celebration with a few family members and friends gathered together in our home. At least, that was what I believed when I woke up that morning. After so many years of marriage, birthdays had become something gentle and familiar. A small cake, a few warm words, maybe a quiet dinner together. I had never been someone who expected grand gestures or expensive gifts. All I ever really wanted was to feel remembered, to feel appreciated. And that morning, I remember standing in the kitchen making coffee, thinking that maybe this year would be a little special. My husband had been acting strangely all week, not in a bad way, just different. He had been making phone calls in the other room, stepping outside to answer messages, even leaving the house more often than usual. At first, I thought he might be planning some kind of surprise for my birthday. It would not have been like him, but the thought made me smile anyway. After so many years together, small surprises still had the power to warm my heart. By the afternoon, our house was beginning to fill with people. My sister arrived first, carrying a small gift bag and giving me a warm hug the moment she walked through the door. Soon after that, a few close friends arrived. Laughter slowly filled the living room, someone turned on soft music in the background, and the smell of dinner began drifting through the house. Everything felt normal, comfortable, exactly the way birthdays had always been. But there was one person missing, my husband. At first, I did not think much about it. He had told me earlier that he needed to run a quick errand before the guests arrived. Still, as the evening went on, I found myself glancing toward the front door every few minutes. People began asking where he was. "Is he on his way?" someone asked. I smiled and nodded. Yes, he should be here soon. But inside, a small feeling of uneasiness had begun to grow. It was not like him to be late for something happening in our own home. Eventually, just as the sun began to set outside, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Someone near the window looked outside and said, "I think he's here." A few people clapped playfully. Someone joked that the guest of honor's husband had finally arrived. I remember smoothing my hands down the front of my dress as I walked toward the front door. Part of me still believed he might walk in carrying flowers or a small gift, maybe even a cake. I opened the door, and for a moment I could not understand what I was seeing. My husband was standing there, on the porch, but he was not alone. Beside him stood a woman I had never seen before. She looked younger than me, confident, comfortable, as if she belonged there. For a second, none of us spoke. Then my husband smiled and stepped inside, and the first words he said made the entire room go silent. He looked at the guests, then at me, and said calmly, "I hope you don't mind, but I brought someone special tonight." And before I could say anything, he turned toward the woman beside him and added something that made my heart stop. He said, "She's the one I wanted you to thank." For a moment, I just stood there. My hand was still resting on the door, and the evening air from outside was brushing softly against my face. But inside the house, everything felt strangely still. The music that had been playing in the background suddenly sounded distant. The conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier faded into silence. Everyone was looking at the same thing: my husband standing in the middle of the room and the woman beside him. I remember blinking a few times, almost as if my eyes needed to adjust to what I was seeing, because nothing about that moment made sense. This was my birthday. Our house was filled with people who had come to celebrate, and yet the person standing beside my husband was a complete stranger. She was dressed elegantly, as if she had been invited to something important. Her posture was confident, her smile is calm, not nervous, not uncomfortable, just comfortable. That was the part that confused me the most. She looked as if she already belonged there. Someone behind me cleared their throat softly. Another guest shifted in their chair. The room was beginning to fill with that strange tension that happens when people feel something is wrong, but no one knows what to say first. I looked at my husband again, hoping he would laugh and explain everything. Maybe she was a colleague from work. Maybe someone who had helped him organize the evening. Maybe there was a perfectly simple explanation for why a stranger had walked into my birthday party on his arm. But he did not laugh. He did not look embarrassed. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the woman's shoulder, and that small gesture made something inside my chest tighten. It was the kind of touch people use when they want to show closeness, familiarity, care. I could feel my heart beating faster now. Still, I tried to remain calm. After so many years of marriage, you learn how to control your emotions in front of others, especially in a room full of guests. So I forced a small smile, the kind of polite smile you give when you are trying to understand a situation that suddenly feels uncomfortable. "Who is she?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded calm, at least on the outside. Inside, my mind was already racing, because deep down, somewhere beneath the confusion, a quiet feeling of dread had begun to form, the kind of feeling that appears when your instincts are trying to warn you about something your heart doesn't want to accept. My husband looked at me for a moment, not nervously, not apologetically, just calmly, as if the answer he was about to give was a perfectly reasonable answer. Then he said her name. I won't repeat it now, because the name itself was not the thing that mattered. What mattered was the way he said it. There was warmth in his voice, familiarity, the kind of tone people use when they are introducing someone important. Around the room, I could see people exchanging glances with one another. Some of our friends looked confused. My sister looked from me to my husband, her eyebrows slowly tightening as if she was trying to understand what was happening. The woman beside him simply stood there quietly, observing the room with a composed expression. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look uncomfortable. In fact, she looked almost amused. And that was the moment when the first real wave of emotion hit me. Not anger, not yet. Something else, something colder. A quiet realization that whatever was happening in front of me was not an accident. This was something my husband had planned. And suddenly the strange behavior from the past week began to make sense. The phone calls, the late evenings, the secret messages, all of it had been leading to this moment. My birthday, a room full of people, and a woman standing beside my husband who clearly meant something more than he was willing to explain right away. I could feel the room waiting, waiting for someone to speak, waiting for someone to explain. But my husband did not seem to feel the tension. Instead, he looked around at the guests, smiled again, and said something that made the situation even more confusing. I thought tonight would be the perfect time to introduce her. Introduce her. The words echoed in my mind. Introduce her? To whom? To me? To our friends? To our family? The more I thought about it, the more the feeling inside my chest began to change. The confusion was slowly turning into something heavier, because deep down I was beginning to realize something that frightened me more than any argument ever could. My husband was not acting like someone who had made a mistake. He was acting like someone who believed he had done nothing wrong at all. There was a time when my husband and I were not strangers to each other. In the early years of our marriage, everything felt simple. Not perfect, of course. No marriage is perfect. But there was a sense of partnership between us. A quiet understanding that we were building a life together one day at a time. I remember the first apartment we lived in after our wedding. It was small, barely big enough for the two of us, with thin walls and a kitchen that could hardly fit a proper table. But back then, none of that mattered. We were young, hopeful, full of plans for the future. On weekends, we would sit together in the living room talking about the life we wanted to build together. We talked about the house we hoped to buy one day, the trips we would take, and the family we imagined creating together. Those conversations used to feel endless. Sometimes we stayed up late into the night, sharing dreams and laughing about the small challenges of starting out in life. In those days, my husband was a very different man from the one who stood in my doorway that evening. He was attentive, protective, the kind of man who held my hand when we walked through crowded places and asked me how my day had been the moment he walked through the door after work. When something good happened in my life, he celebrated with me. When something difficult happened, he stood beside me and reminded me that we would face it together. That word, together, meant something to both of us back then. Years passed, and like many couples, our lives slowly became busier. Responsibilities grew. Work demanded more time and attention. The small apartment eventually turned into a house, and the quiet evenings we once shared were replaced by long work days and the normal routines of adult life. Still, even through those changes, I believed our relationship remained strong. We celebrated anniversaries, we supported each other through difficult career changes and difficult moments. From the outside, anyone looking at us would have said we were a stable couple who had simply grown comfortable after many years together. And perhaps that was part of the problem. Comfort has a way of slowly turning into distance if you are not careful. At first, the changes between us were almost invisible. Small things, things that seemed too ordinary to question. My husband began spending more time at work. He said the company had taken on new projects that required extra attention. Sometimes he arrived later than usual. Other times he said he needed to attend work events or meet with colleagues. And each time I asked about it, he had a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe him. After so many years of marriage, trust becomes something you rely on without questioning. So I ignored the quiet voice in the back of my mind that sometimes asked whether everything was truly as simple as it seemed. Looking back now, I realize something important. Distance in a relationship rarely arrives suddenly. It grows quietly, conversation by conversation, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize the person sitting across from you feels more like a stranger than a partner. There were moments during those years when I noticed that change. Moments when he seemed distracted when I was speaking. Moments when his attention drifted somewhere else entirely. Sometimes I would ask him a question and realize he had not heard a single word I had said. When I pointed it out, he would smile and apologize. He always had an explanation. Work stress, fatigue, deadlines. And because I had spent so many years loving him, I chose to accept those explanations. Love has a way of making us patient, sometimes too patient. Because the truth is, when you have built a life with someone over many years, the idea that they might be slowly drifting away from you is not something your heart wants to believe. So instead of asking difficult questions, I convinced myself that the distance between us was temporary. I believed that once things settled down, we would find our way back to each other. But now, standing in that living room on my birthday night with a room full of guests watching my husband introduce another woman into our home, I could not ignore the truth anymore. The distance that had been growing quietly for years had finally reached a moment where it could no longer be hidden. The truth is, the changes in my husband did not begin on my birthday. That moment was simply the first time the truth appeared where everyone could see it. But the warning signs had been there long before that evening. I just didn't understand what they meant at the time. The first thing that changed was his routine. For many years, my husband had been a man of habits. He woke up at the same time every morning, drank his coffee while reading the news, and left for work at almost the exact same hour. In the evenings, he usually came home around the same time as well. Dinner together had been something we rarely missed. Even when work was busy, he always made an effort to sit with me for a while before the night ended. But slowly, those routines began to disappear. At first, it was small things. He started checking his phone more often. Sometimes he stepped outside to answer calls. When I asked who it was, he would say something simple like, "Just work." I believed him. After all, people receive work calls all the time. But after a while, the phone calls became more frequent. Sometimes his phone would vibrate late at night. Other times it would light up while we were sitting together in the living room. Each time that happened, he would glance at the screen and quickly turn the phone over so I could not see it. I remember noticing that small movement more than once, but I told myself I was imagining things. Trust is something you build over many years, and once it exists, it is difficult to question. Then there were the late evenings. He began coming home later than usual. At first, he said he was staying late at the office. Then he started mentioning work dinners, meetings, networking events. Again, none of those things sounded unusual on their own, but when they started happening several times every week, something inside me began to feel uneasy. Still, I tried to remain patient. Marriage requires patience. That is what I always believed. But one evening, something happened that stayed with me longer than the others. He came home much later than expected. When he walked through the door, he looked distracted, not tired, not stressed, just distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else. I asked him how his evening had gone. He said it had been a long meeting. Then he went straight to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. While he was standing there, his phone buzzed again. The screen lit up on the counter. I was not trying to look at it, but it was impossible not to notice the message. There was a name on the screen, a woman's name. For a moment, I told myself it could have been a coworker. After all, many women work in offices. But the message itself made my heart pause. It was short, just a few words. "I had a wonderful time tonight." Before I could say anything, my husband picked up the phone quickly and slipped it back into his pocket. He noticed that I had seen the message. For a brief moment, we looked at each other. Then he said something that sounded almost too casual, "Just someone from work." I nodded. I did not argue. I did not ask questions. But something inside me felt different after that moment. Not angry, just uncertain. After that night, I started noticing other small details. He paid more attention to his appearance before leaving the house. He changed his cologne. Sometimes he left the house earlier than usual. Other times he returned home later than expected. Each of those things on their own might have meant nothing, but together they began forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Still, I did not confront him. Part of me was afraid of what the answer might be, and another part of me still hoped I was wrong. because after so many years of marriage, the idea that my husband might be sharing his time and attention with another woman was not something I was ready to accept. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I waited. And I told myself that sooner or later the truth would reveal itself. What I did not know then was that the truth would arrive in the most humiliating way possible, not in private, not in a quiet conversation between two people who had shared a life together, but in front of a room full of guests on the very night that was supposed to celebrate me. After that night, something inside me changed. It was not something visible from the outside. If anyone had looked at us during those weeks, they would have seen the same couple they had always known. We still shared the same house. We still sat at the same dinner table. We still went through the same daily routines. But inside me, a quiet tension had begun to grow. Once you notice a crack in something you believed was solid, it becomes impossible to ignore it. Suddenly, small details start to stand out. Things that once felt normal begin to look different. I started paying attention to the way my husband behaved when he was at home. Sometimes he sat in the living room scrolling through his phone, smiling faintly at messages I could not see. Other times he stepped outside to take calls that lasted much longer than any work conversation I had ever heard him have before. When he returned inside, he often acted as if nothing unusual had happened. If I asked who he had been speaking to, the answer was always the same: just work. Those two words began appearing more and more in our conversations: just work, just work, just work. But something about the way he said it began to sound rehearsed, almost automatic, like a line he had repeated too many times. There were other changes, too. My husband began paying more attention to things he had once ignored. He bought new shirts, changed the way he styled his hair. I even started using a different cologne. I noticed it the first evening he wore it. It was stronger than the one he had used for years. Different. When I mentioned it casually, he simply shrugged and said he had decided to try something new. Again, nothing about that explanation sounded unreasonable, but when changes begin to appear one after another, they start forming a pattern. And patterns are difficult to ignore. Then there were the weekends. For most of our marriage, weekends had been our quiet time. We ran errands together, watched movies in the evening. Sometimes I invite friends over for dinner. But suddenly, he began having plans that did not include me. Business meetings, company events, old friends he had not seen in years. Each explanation sounded believable, but the frequency of those plans slowly began to push me out of the picture. There were weekends when I spent entire afternoons alone in the house while he was working. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning, reading, calling friends, but no matter what I did, the same question kept returning to my mind. Where was he really going? One evening, that question nearly slipped out of my mouth. He had come home late again, later than usual. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in. He placed his keys on the table and greeted me with the same casual smile he always used. For a moment, I considered asking him directly, "Who is she?" But the words never left my lips. Because the truth is, sometimes we remain silent not because we do not want answers, but because we are afraid of what those answers might reveal. Instead, I simply asked him if he wanted dinner. He said he had already eaten. Then he walked past me and disappeared into the bedroom. And that was the moment when the distance between us became undeniable. Not because of something dramatic, not because of an argument, but because of the quiet emptiness that had begun to fill the spaces between our conversations. Two people can live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, share the same meals, and still feel like complete strangers. Weeks passed like that. The tension inside me continued to grow, even though I tried to hide it from everyone around me. Then my birthday approached, and strangely, my husband began acting differently again. He seemed almost excited. He asked me what kind of dinner I wanted. He mentioned inviting a few friends. At first, I was surprised. For a long time, he had shown little interest in celebrating things like birthdays, but suddenly he was planning something, organizing things, making phone calls. I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about everything. Maybe the distance between us had been only temporary. Maybe he was trying to reconnect. Maybe this birthday celebration was his way of reminding me that our marriage still meant something to him. Looking back now, that hope feels almost painful to remember. Because while I was preparing to celebrate another year of my life, my husband was preparing something very different, something that would change the way I saw him forever. By the time everyone had arrived that evening, the house felt warm and alive. Laughter filled the living room, music played softly in the background, and people moved around the house carrying plates of food and glasses of wine. My sister was talking with a few friends near the kitchen, and someone had already placed the birthday cake on the dining table. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way a birthday celebration should, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe the strange tension I had been feeling for weeks had finally come to an end. Maybe my husband truly had planned something special. Maybe the distance between us had been simply my imagination. But that illusion lasted only a few seconds after he walked through the door. He stepped into the house first, smiling at the guests as if nothing about the moment was unusual. Then the woman followed him inside. She moved confidently, her posture relaxed, as if she had been invited to this house many times before. The room grew quiet almost immediately. It was not a dramatic silence. No one gasped, no one shouted, but the laughter that had been filling the room slowly faded as people realized something was wrong. My husband closed the door behind them and looked around at the guests. Then he looked at me. And the strange thing was, he did not seem nervous. He did not look guilty. If anything, he looked calm, almost proud. The woman beside him stood quietly, observing the room. Her eyes moved slowly from one guest to another before finally resting on me. I couldn't read her expression completely, but there was something in her gaze that made my stomach tighten, something that suggested she already knew more about my life than I knew about hers. My sister was the first person to speak. She stepped closer and asked gently, "Who is this?" It was a simple question, the kind of question anyone would ask when a stranger enters a private celebration. My husband smiled again. Then he placed his hand lightly on the woman's back, guiding her a few steps forward. The gesture felt strangely intimate, too familiar. He said, "Everyone." He looked around the room. "I'd like you to meet someone." The words hung in the air. I felt every eye in the room shift toward him, then toward her, and finally toward me. For a brief moment, I hoped he would say she was a coworker, or maybe a business partner, maybe someone who had helped organize the event. But he did not say any of those things. Instead, he said something that made the entire room feel smaller. He said, "This is someone very important to me." Important. The word echoed in my mind. Important in what way? I could feel my heart beating faster now. My husband continued speaking as if nothing about the situation was strange. He explained that she had been helping him with many things over the past year. He said she had supported him during difficult moments, that she had helped him see life differently. Each sentence felt like a quiet blade pressing deeper into the space between us. My husband turned toward me. His voice softened slightly. And then he said something that made several people in the room exchange uneasy glances. "Before we start the cake and everything else," he said calmly, "I thought tonight would be a good time for you to thank her." Thank her? For a second, I honestly believed I had misheard him. Thank her for what? The room remained completely silent. Even the music in the background suddenly felt too loud. I could see the confusion on the faces of our friends. My sister looked at me again, her expression now filled with concern. But my husband continued speaking as if the situation was perfectly reasonable. "She's done a lot for both of us," he added. Both of us. The words landed heavily in the room. I looked at the woman standing beside him. She did not seem embarrassed. She did not look uncomfortable. Instead, she watched me quietly, almost as if she were waiting for my reaction. And in that moment, standing in the middle of my own birthday celebration with a room full of guests staring at me, I finally understood something that had been slowly revealing itself for weeks. This woman was not just someone my husband knew. She was someone who had already taken a place in his life, a place that once belonged to me. For several seconds after my husband said those words, no one in the room moved. The silence felt heavy, not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a quiet moment together, but the uneasy silence that appears when everyone realizes something deeply wrong is unfolding right in front of them. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Even the music playing in the background now sounded distant, as if it no longer belonged to the room. Every pair of eyes was on me, waiting. My husband stood beside the woman, his hand still resting lightly behind her back. The gesture looked natural to him, but to everyone else in that room it carried a meaning that could not be ignored. I looked at him carefully. After all the years we had spent together, I knew his face better than anyone. I could usually tell when he was nervous, when he was unsure, when he felt guilty about something. But that evening, his expression showed none of those things. He looked calm, almost impatient, as if he expected me to respond quickly so the evening could continue. That was the moment something inside me shifted. For weeks I had been confused. For weeks I had tried to ignore the strange feeling that something was wrong in our marriage. But standing there in front of our friends and family, watching him present another woman at my birthday celebration as if it were a perfectly normal situation, the confusion slowly disappeared. In its place came something clearer. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. I took a slow breath. Then I stepped forward. The room remained silent as I moved closer to them. I stopped a few feet away from my husband and the woman beside him. Up close, I could see her expression more clearly now. She was studying me carefully, almost curiously, as if she had been waiting for this moment. I turned my eyes toward my husband first. "Thank her?" I repeated quietly. My voice was calm, but the words carried a weight that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. My husband nodded slightly. "Yes," he said, "for everything she's done." Everything she's done. The sentence hung in the air. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "And what exactly has she done for me?" I asked. The question was simple, but the way the room reacted made it clear that everyone understood the tension behind it. My husband hesitated. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but after so many years of knowing him, I recognized it immediately. He had not expected that question. He glanced briefly at the woman beside him, as if searching for the right words. Then he looked back at me. "She's helped me understand things about life," he said slowly. "She's helped me grow." Grow. The word felt strangely out of place in the middle of my birthday celebration. I could hear someone behind me shift in their chair again. My sister had moved closer now, standing just a few steps away as if she was ready to step in if things became worse. But I raised my hand slightly without looking at her, not to stop her, just to signal that I was still in control of the moment. Then I turned my attention to the woman. For the first time since she entered the house, I spoke directly to her. "And you?" I asked. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised that I had addressed her so directly. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at my husband. The silent exchange between them was not unnoticed by anyone in the room. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost polite. "I think he wanted you to understand that things are changing." Changing. The word echoed through my mind. The way she said it felt less like an explanation and more like a declaration, as if a decision had already been made, as if the future she was describing had already begun. And suddenly, the strange behavior from the past months made perfect sense. The late nights, the secret messages, the distance that had slowly grown between my husband and me, all of it had been leading to this moment. But what neither of them seemed to realize was that they had chosen the worst possible place for that moment to happen. My birthday, my home, a room full of people who had known our marriage for years. I looked around the room slowly. Our friends, my sister, people who had celebrated anniversaries with us, people who had watched our lives unfold together over time. Then I looked back at my husband. And when I spoke again, my voice was still calm, but there was no confusion left in it. "Then maybe," I said quietly, "tonight is the perfect time for everyone here to understand what's really been happening." When I said those words, the room seemed to grow even quieter. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize something important is about to be said, but no one knows exactly what that truth will look like once it finally appears. My husband shifted slightly where he stood. For the first time that evening, I noticed something different in his expression, a hint of discomfort. Perhaps he had expected confusion, maybe even tears, but he had not expected me to remain calm. He had not expected me to speak. I looked at the guests around the room, people who had known us for years, friends who had sat at this same table during holidays, people who had listened to us talk about our lives together, our plans, our memories. And suddenly, I realized something. Every single person in that room deserved to understand what they were witnessing. Not rumors, not half explanations, the truth. I took a slow breath. "Many of you here have known my husband and me for a very long time," I began quietly. "You have celebrated our anniversaries. You have visited our home. Some of you were even there the day we moved into this house." A few people nodded slowly. The memories I was describing belonged to them, too. "For years," I continued, "I believed we were building a life together." I turned my eyes toward my husband. And maybe for a while we truly were. He did not interrupt. He simply watched me, his jaw slightly tense. But over the past year, I said calmly, things began to change. I did not raise my voice. There was no anger in my tone, just quiet honesty. My husband began coming home later and later. Phone calls that used to happen in front of me suddenly moved outside. Messages appeared on his phone that he didn't want me to see. The room remained silent. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down at their hands. And one evening, I continued, I saw a message that said something very simple. I paused, just long enough for the words to settle in the room. It said, "I had a wonderful time tonight." My husband's eyes moved briefly toward the floor. The woman beside him crossed her arms slowly. That was the moment, I said softly, that something in our marriage had changed. I looked at the guests again. But even then, I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't care, but because after many years of marriage, you sometimes hope that the person you love will find their way back to you. A few people in the room nodded quietly. They understood that feeling. But instead, I continued, that distance only grew. And tonight, I gestured lightly toward the woman standing beside my husband. It seems we have all finally met the reason why. The statement hung in the air, not shouted, not dramatic, just spoken plainly. For the first time since she had entered the house, the woman's calm expression shifted slightly. She looked at my husband again, as if waiting for him to say something, but he remained silent. I turned back to him. Perhaps you thought tonight would be the easiest way to explain everything, bringing her here, in front of everyone. My voice softened even more. On my birthday. The weight of that moment settled over the room. Even the guests who had tried to stay neutral could no longer pretend that this was a normal celebration. Then I said the final thing that needed to be said. You asked me to thank her. I paused. And in a way, I suppose I should. My husband looked up quickly, surprised. Several guests exchanged confused glances, but I continued calmly. Because tonight, she didn't just walk into my birthday party. She revealed the truth about my marriage. And sometimes, knowing the truth is the only gift you really need. When I finished speaking, the room remained completely still. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one tried to pretend the evening could simply continue the way it had started. The truth had settled into the room like a heavy weight, and everyone present could feel it. My husband stood a few steps away from me, his expression no longer calm. The confidence he had carried when he first walked through the door had disappeared. Now he looked uncertain, almost as if he had only just realized that the situation he had created was no longer under his control. The woman beside him remained quiet. Her posture was no longer as relaxed as it had been when she first arrived. Her arms were crossed now, and the small smile she had worn earlier had faded. Around the room, our friends avoided looking directly at anyone. Some stared at the floor. Others glanced awkwardly at their phones. No one seemed to know what the correct reaction should be. My sister was the first person who moved. She stepped closer to me and gently placed her hand on my arm. The gesture was small, but it carried a quiet message. You are not alone. I took a slow breath. Strangely, I did not feel the anger I had expected to feel. Instead, there was a calmness inside me, Not happiness, not relief, but clarity. Sometimes the most painful moments in life are also the ones that finally remove all the confusion. For months, I had been questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things, trying to convince myself that the distance growing between my husband and me was only temporary. But standing there in that room, everything was suddenly clear. My husband had already made his choices long before that evening. Tonight had simply been the moment when those choices became visible to everyone. I looked at him one more time. For many years, that man had been the center of my life. We had built a home together, shared memories, celebrated victories, supported each other through difficult times, or at least that was what I had believed. But sometimes the person you think you know best turns out to be someone entirely different. And when that realization arrives, you have two choices. You can break apart, or you can stand still, accept the truth, and begin walking in a new direction. I chose the second. Without saying another word, I walked toward the dining table. The birthday cake was still sitting there. The candles had not yet been lit. For a moment, I looked at it quietly. A cake meant to celebrate another year of my life, another year of memories, another year of lessons. Then I turned back toward the room. My voice was calm when I spoke. "I think the evening is over," I said gently. No one expected tonight to turn out this way. Some guests nodded slowly. Others began gathering their things. People moved quietly toward the door, offering small words of support as they passed. Within minutes, the room that had been filled with laughter earlier that evening began to empty. Eventually, only a few of us remained: my sister, my husband, the woman he had brought, and me. But by that point, there was nothing left that needed to be said. Some truths do not require long conversations. They simply require acceptance. Later that night, after the house had grown quiet again, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where only hours earlier everyone had gathered to celebrate. I thought about the years behind me, the memories, the choices, the life I had believed I was living, and slowly I began to understand something important. Sometimes life does not give you the celebration you expected. Sometimes it gives you something far more difficult, the truth. And although the truth can be painful, it also has a strange kind of freedom hidden inside it. Because once you finally see things clearly, you are no longer trapped in illusions. You are free to begin again. If you have ever experienced a moment when someone you trusted changed the direction of your life in ways you never expected, you are not alone. Many people carry stories like this quietly in their hearts. You can share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Sometimes speaking about these moments helps others realize they are not the only ones going through them. And if you appreciate emotional storytelling like this, consider subscribing to Quiet Voice of Her Life for more stories about family, relationships, and the quiet truths life sometimes reveals.